This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so we are here and we are covering till we have been covering the syllabus till, let's say, something like build pipelines. We said some when a developer commits a code to the develop branch, you will have a continuous integration pipeline that's getting triggered. And this continuous integration pipeline, the main job of this continuous integration pipeline is to make sure to go ahead and give you something known as an artifact. So let's bring in an artifact here. I have an artifact right now that's getting produced out of my build pipeline, which is nothing but a compiled code. Like, I basically send the code in as a raw format. I sent in I sent in the code in the form of raw format, and I'm saving the code. I'm version controlling the code in, let's say, a repository called Azure Repos. Finally, when I basically build my pipeline, when I commit my code into my develop branch, when I build my pipeline, I am getting an artifact in return. And now what should I do with this artifact? Is that I want to take this artifact and I then want to release it onto a cloud called Azure. Now let's say this artifact that we got is a .NET Core application. For .NET Core application or .NET Full Framework, anything it can be. Now I need to design a strategy to go ahead and create something called as a release architecture. What do I mean by this? As a release architecture, what kind of release pipelines am I really talking about out here? Now, release is one of the most important phases. So let's talk about this a bit. Now I'm talking about a release. So what I'll do is that I'll take this artifact and I will link this artifact to my release process. So I'm doing one thing, I'm taking this artifact and I'm saying, okay, fine, this is the artifact that I need to link it to my release pipeline or to my release process. How do we link? We'll talk about that in a while. And I want to take this artifact into different stages. What do I mean by different stages out here? Is that in my organization, I have various teams like developers. So I'll have a stage called development. I have developers for whom I am building a stage called development. I have testers, the QA team, for whom I'm building a stage called testing or quality analysis. Finally, I also need to take my code to the final destination, which is known as production. Meaning, as and when the code gets, as and when I link the code to the release pipeline, the first stage that I'm actually looking at is a development stage. So, what is a stage again? Nothing but a stage is nothing but, let's say, in very layman term, I would say it is a resource group in Azure with, let's say, a web app inside it, having a web application inside it. And what this stage is going to do, or what this development stage is going to do, is that it's just going to take the code and take it to a web application called development. Meaning the code is being delivered to an application called dev web app that is sitting in a resource group called devrg. So I have a resource group called devrg inside which I have a web application called dev web app, and I'm taking the code and delivering it to this particular application or targeting this particular web application called dev web app so that the developers of my team can test the application on the cloud. They are not testing it on their local machine. They want to test the application on the cloud. Once the developers are good with their testing, I will go ahead, promote the development artifact, or promote the artifact into the next stage, which is called testing, which is again nothing but a resource group in Azure called QARG probably, and a web app in Azure called QA web app. Now this is for the QA team to test their code out. They will have different test cases that they want to use against this particular web application. And once they are done testing, I will now want to take my code to the final destination, which is called a production stage, which is prod production, which is the final destination of my code. And this is now intended for my client, meaning I'm testing here and I'm basically testing in the development stage. I'm testing in the testing stage. I'm testing in the, and then I'm promoting the code into the production environment with the right approvals. I also have a process called approvals in place. With the right amount of approvals, this is where I deliver the code to my client. This is where my client as such comes into picture. This is where my client is involved out here. So a release pipeline is a multi-stage process wherein you are taking the code that is given by your build pipeline and releasing it onto different environments in the form of increments. In the form of initial increments, you're taking your code, getting it to the team called development, sending your code or promoting your code to a next environment called testing, and then into production. This is what we are trying to do out here. So any questions before we begin with the actual process, guys? Anyone, any questions? All right, so this is my pipeline, which is called .NET Core build pipeline. This is the one which is producing the artifact to me. What I'm going to do right now is I'll open up something called as release. So I have pipelines and I have something known as releases out here. So there are two things that are there on my screen. So let me give it a second and let me open up my stenciler. Okay, so there is something known as pipelines that we were dealing with till now. There's something called as releases, which we are starting up with now. So what I'm doing out here is that I'm now telling that this is releases, and it looks something like this. It says no release pipelines found, and I'll say new release pipeline. And once I click on new release pipeline out here, this is how it's going to look like. So I'll say start with an empty job. I'm not creating anything. I'll just say start with an empty job. And firstly, I'll change the name of my release pipeline to .NET Core release pipeline. So I'm now telling that this is a release pipeline for a code called .NET Core. And there are two things out here. One, it is telling what are the artifacts that you want to add, or what are the artifacts that you want to link to your release pipeline. Meaning something like this. It's now asking you that, you know what, can you please give me what is the artifact that you want to link to your pipeline? Without an artifact or without a source, you cannot go ahead and create a release pipeline. So I'll say, okay, great. I want to add an artifact firstly. And the name of the artifact in my case, or the source of the artifact in my case, is an Azure DevOps build pipeline. Like I have a build pipeline in Azure DevOps. That is the source to the artifact that I have. And this is the project called 7am class project, under which I have a build pipeline with the name called .NET Core build. This is the pipeline that I need. And whatever is the latest version of the artifact that is being produced from the pipeline, please take it. This is something that I'm telling to my build pipeline right now, and I will say add. So I have added an artifact. So this is where I am. I added an artifact here, and the pipeline is good. Now it's asking me, what do you want to do next? Where do you want to deploy your code? How do you want to take your code? I will say, okay, fine. The first environment, now these are called environments or also called stages. So the first environment or the first stage that I want to go in is something called as a development. I want to take my code and give it to something called development in an automated fashion. I'm not doing it manually. I'm doing it in an automated fashion. Let's see what is automated fashion that I'm talking about. And finally, it's telling me, okay, the stage needs to have some tasks. Now, it is the same, like, you have the same thing in build pipelines also, like variables, tasks, sorry, pipeline tasks, variables, retention, all that stuff, inside which it's now going to tell you that, okay, fine, great. Can you give me some additional inputs? Like, what is the name of the agent that you want to run this job on? Meaning, what is the pool? What is the name? I will say this is the Azure Pipelines. It's a hosted pool. And I will say whatever is the latest agent of Windows, you can take it, not a problem. Finally, I will add a task. And in my case right now, I am adding a task to take my code and release it onto a web app in Azure. So for that, I will type in Azure App Service. And as and when I do Azure App Service, it's now telling me, okay, fine, there are tasks like Azure. There is tasks like Azure App Service Manage, Azure App Service Settings, and etc. And there is something called Azure App Service Deploy, meaning I want to take the code and deploy it onto, let's say, an Azure web app or a web app running in Azure. I'll say add. This is a task that I want to go ahead and deploy it out. As and when I add this task, now it's telling me, great, I understand you want to add a task, but I require some settings, additional inputs out here from you. I understand this is an app service deployment, but can you tell me where your Azure app service is? Or rather, where do you have that particular app service in? And it's asking me what is the Azure subscription that your application service really is. Again, Azure DevOps, sorry, Azure DevOps is a different service. Azure DevOps altogether, this one is a different service, and this in itself is a software as a service, meaning you don't have to install anything and so on. You can directly use it on the web. Azure DevOps is a software as a service, and I have an Azure web app that is running out of a cloud called Azure. So I have this web app and I have a subscription and I have a tenant. So I have an Azure tenant under which I had a subscription. I have a subscription. Under the subscription, I have a web app that is running, and I want to now go ahead and deploy my code onto the web app that is running on Azure. Meaning, I somehow need to make sure that my Azure DevOps can communicate with the tenant of Azure or with the subscription of Azure. I'll put it in this way, with the subscription of Azure, so that it can communicate with the web application and make sure it can deploy the code. This is what I want to do right now. So make sure it can deploy the code and etc. So can anyone now give me an input on how should I connect these two things, the portal and the DevOps? What can you think of in here? What can I, which kind of a concept do you all think that I can use here?
Service connection.
Service connection, great. Exactly. This is what I'm coming to. I want a service connection with which can help me, or which can help me as in which can help Azure DevOps to to sorry, to communicate effectively with the Azure portal, and can deploy and can deploy, let's say, various things, or can deploy basically and can talk to the subscription and etc. This is what I want my service connection between Azure DevOps and the subscription of Azure. I want to do this one. So in here, it's now asking me what is the Azure subscription, and just beside it, I have something called as manage. Or you can also basically go into the project settings, and in the project settings, you can go to something called as service connections, and I will say new service connection. And in here, I would like to select something called as Azure Resource Manager. This is the service connection. This is the type of the service connection that I want to establish. And I will say next. Now it's telling there is something known as service principal automatic, which might not work for a lot of cases. There's something known as service principal manual. This is something that I'm interested in. I'll select service principal manual and I'll say next. As and when I do it, it's telling me what kind of cloud are you? Are you Azure China, Azure, let's say normal the cloud, or US government, etc. I know that I'm an Azure cloud, and now it's asking me for the subscription ID. Guys, where can I get the subscription ID from? Anyone? Where should I go to
Azure
get the
portal.
subscription? Okay, Azure portal. So I'm here in the Azure portal. So where can I get the subscription ID from here?
Under subscription.
Okay. Anyone else? Can anyone else take this question? Where can I get the subscription ID from? Anyone else apart from Naveen can take this question here?
Oh, from subscription only we'll take.
From subscription only. So I'll go into the subscription, and once I hit the subscription here on the OU page, I'm getting something known as subscription ID. In the subscription ID, I'm taking the subscription ID, copying the subscription ID, going into the settings of Azure DevOps, and placing it in here. This is the subscription ID that I want to get connected to, and I'm being asked what is the name of the subscription. So I'll say, okay, fine. The name of the subscription, the offer is pay as you go, but the name of the subscription is something like Azure Classes. This is the name of the subscription that I have. So I'll just select, or I'll just copy this out. I'll place it in here. So I've taken my subscription ID, I've taken my subscription name, and now it's asking me what is the service principal ID. Now, what exactly do I mean by service principal ID out here, or what exactly that I mean by this one is that in order to establish the connection between the Azure DevOps and the Azure portal, I need to create something called as service connection on the Azure DevOps side. Service connection is being done at the Azure DevOps side. On the Azure side, in order to help Azure DevOps establish this connection, I need to create something known as a service principal. Now, here is the concept. Anyone or anything, meaning whether a user or if an application like Azure DevOps want to go and talk to Azure portal, it needs to be registered in the Azure Active Directory. In here, it needs to be registered as an application, because it's not a user, right? It's an application. If it's a user, I would have gone into the user section of Azure, or of the Azure Active Directory. I could have added a user, like I could have added Azure DevOps like a user in here, and then I could have started deploying this out, or then I could have started using this out. But Azure DevOps is not a user. Azure DevOps is an application. So I need to register Azure DevOps as an application under the Azure portal or under the Azure tenant. How do I do that? Is I am now going into something known as the Azure Active Directory. Something known as Azure Active Directory out here, under which there are users, groups, and etc. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in something known as app registrations. And inside this app registration, I will say new app registration. And I will say this is 7am class project. DevOps Service Connection SVC. I'm just giving a name here and I'll say register. That's it. I'm just creating a user or I'm creating an application in the Azure Active Directory who can go ahead and basically talk to Azure DevOps, meaning who can go ahead and talk to Azure portal. And this is the application registration that I need to be using in my service connection out here. It's now telling me what is the service principal ID, and if you look at here, it's telling client ID for connecting the endpoint. So I'll say, okay, great. Since it's the client ID which is connecting with the endpoint, this is what the client ID is asking for. So I'm taking the client ID, placing it in here under the service principal ID, and then it's telling me, great, you have the client ID. Can you give me a secret? Because if you have an ID, if you want to use Azure DevOps, if you want Azure DevOps to use Azure, can you please give me something called as a key out here? Because I need to authenticate you. So I will say come here and there is an option called certificates and secrets. There is this option known as certificates and secrets, and inside this I will go ahead and create a new secret out here. I'll say a new client secret. I'll say the name of the secret is DevOps temp secret or some secret name, and I'll say add. As and when I add, I have a secret value out here. I'll copy it, paste it in a notepad so that I can use this at a later point in time. And I'll go back into my Azure DevOps portal and I'll place the secret here. This is what I'm doing. I created a secret for my app registration in Azure. I'm taking that secret, putting it in here called service principal key. And finally, I will give something called as a tenant ID. You will get it here in the app registration itself, something known as a directory or a tenant ID. So I'll choose this. I'll just copy this out. I'll paste it out here. And finally, I now need to verify. So I will say verify this one out. And now it's telling me the verification has failed. And it's giving me a message telling that it failed to query the service connection API, so on and so forth, forbidden error and all that stuff. And if I scroll down onto the error, it's telling the client ID something like this with the object ID something like that is not having authorization to perform an action called Microsoft.resource read over something like this. What do you understand by this error, guys? What do you really understand by this error? What do you think I have missed doing on this way? Anyone? What do you understand from this error out here?
I think the subscription has the only read access, not write.
Subscription has only read access. Okay, not right. Okay. Any more inputs here? Anyone? Any more inputs here? Guys, these are the actual issues what you face in the environment. So this is for your benefit. So please try to answer it out or please try to guess it out. Tell me your thoughts so that we can go from there. Otherwise, I could have just gone ahead and created a service connection. So this is for your benefit. So guys, I'm just expecting some inputs. Tell me what you understand by this error. This is this error out here, which is giving me all this error message out here. If you read this error, what do you understand by this? I'm seeing it in the chat. Now this is the error response what I'm getting.
Permission is missing.
Permissions. Okay, permission is missing. Okay, what do I mean by permission is missing? That's right, permission is missing, but what exactly permission is missing out here is that I have created a service principal in the Azure Active Directory, but did I give that particular service principal a permission over my subscription? Did I tell that, okay, fine, you know what, this service principal has an access to the subscription? No, I have only created it at the tenant. I have not done anything. I've just created it at the tenant. So in order for the service principal to now start using my Azure subscription, I will go into my subscription. This is the only subscription that I do have. I will go into my subscription. Sorry, I'll go into my subscription. And in the subscription, I'll go into something called identity and access management. And in the identity and access management, I'll go ahead and add a role assignment, inside which I'll just take a contributor role because I at least need a contributor role out here. I'll say next. And in here, I'll say assign access to user groups to service principal. I'll say select members. Instead of selecting a user now, I'm adding my service principal. This called 7am class DevOps project, which I just created. And I'll now select this out and I'll now say review and assign. So now I am adding a role to this particular service principal, which is nothing but, or which is also known as an app registration in Azure. So I'm just adding this particular role now. And once I added this role, I'll now again come back and say verify. And yes, this will take some time in order to basically get reflected. And now it's now telling me that the verification is successful, meaning I'm successfully able to query your subscription. I'm successfully able to basically go ahead and get your subscription, etc. I am good right now. And now I'll just give a name to the service connection called, I'll say this is 7am SVC service connection out here. And I'll say grant access to all the pipelines and I'll say verify and save. So in the service connection right now, I went ahead and added one more service connection. Earlier we had a Sonar Cloud service connection, which we were using to communicate with the Sonar Cloud. And finally, I have one more service connection called 7am SVC out here. Now what I'm going to do is I'll go into my release pipeline, just do a refresh out here and select my service connection called 7am SVC. This is the service connection that I do have. I'm selecting the 7am SVC out here. And now it's asking me, okay, fine, where do you want to deploy it? I'm saying this is web app and Windows, and it's asking me what is the name of the app service, which I don't have yet. My Azure subscription is really empty. I do not have anything in here. If I go into the resource groups of my Azure subscription, I don't have any resource groups. So what I'll do is I'll start creating one, or I'll just start creating a web app right now. I'll say app service. I'll now start creating a web application in a resource group called devrg. So I'll say a resource group with the name called devrg. And I will say that the name of the application service is called dev web application Hola US East 2. Just giving a name to the application. So this is the name of the project and everything. That's what I'm working for. So I'll just say, okay, fine, this is web application like this. And I will say that the code that I'm deploying is, let's say, a .NET 3.1. And I'll say this is East US 2. And I will select a plan. I will say this is plan 01 or dev plan. And I will say change this. And I'll just put it in a free tier right now. And I'll just do a next. And I'll disable the deployment. I'll disable the monitoring. And finally, review and grade this out. I'll say no. And I'll say review and grade. So what I'm doing is that I'm now creating a web application in a free tier inside my subscription so that I can use this web application for or to host my code. So I'm doing this and I'm deploying the application. It will take a minute or so. And once the application is deployed, let's come back to our release pipeline and see what are all the settings that I can use or what are all the settings that I need to use in the release pipeline right now. So it created a dev plan, and in a minute it will go ahead and create my application service also. And finally, I'll come back to my release pipeline in order to use this service out. So any questions till here, guys? Anything that I can take till here? Anyone, anything that I can take till here? This is done, and I have a resource group right now called dev-rg, inside which if I just refresh, I will have a dev plan and I'll have an app service with a name called dev, something like which what I created right now. It's not getting reflected, but it's there. It'll take some time to get reflected out here. And now what I'll do is I'll refresh my screen here and I'll do a drop down here, and I'm able to see that there is dev web app Ola USEs 2. The same thing what I just created right now. This is the only application service that I have, so that's the reason it's getting reflected out here. And finally, I will now say that, you know what, the zip file is not this, but the zip file is something that I produced from the build pipeline. So what I did is that I clicked on these three dots that was here. This will open up this particular page, and now I'll just go inside this page and I will select the drop location and where my zip file is, and I'll say OK. So now I am doing a deployment of a zip file called .NET Core application.zip, which is the artifact that I have, and I'm dropping this zip file, meaning I'm targeting the zip file onto an Azure web app that is running on Azure using a service connection. And now I'll say save. I'll say this is a single stage release pipeline. So I have a single stage release pipeline that is created. Finally, I'll say create a release. I'll click on this button called create a release. And now it's going to ask me what is the stage that you want to create a release. I'll say this is development and I'll say create. And this is the release 1 that I have. I'm taking this pipeline. I'm basically taking my artifact and I am releasing it on to Azure. And now it's trying to acquire an agent. The first thing it will do, the pipeline will do, it will try to go ahead and get an agent because we have selected something called as a Azure hosted agent. The second thing it's going to do is that it's going to download all the artifact. The third thing that it's going to do is that it's going to go ahead and release the code onto the Azure App Service. So now it's telling, okay, fine, I'm trying to get the connection called something. It will try to get this connection, and finally it will try to deploy the code onto your Azure web app out here. And this is the code that we had, guys. If I go into my repository right now, and if I go into the develop branch of my repository, the last editing that I did here into the pages, into the cs.html, the last editing that I did here is I said this is the .NET Core application version 3. This is the current running code that I have. This is the current running version that I have. And if I go into the release pipeline, it's just taking that code. It's just taking that zip file and it is releasing that zip file, meaning it's unpacking that zip file and releasing that particular zip onto my application. Just releasing that particular zip onto my application right now, and it said this is done. So it took about 53 seconds to go ahead and deploy this out. And if I go into my Azure portal, just refresh this page out once, I have the web application. I can now basically go ahead and browse this application, and this will take a minute to show up because yeah. So once this is done, do you see now it's telling this is my .NET application using Azure DevOps version 3. The same thing that was here in this page, this is the .NET application build using Azure DevOps version 3. It's now telling, okay, this is version 3, and I've deployed a version 3 for you. This is a manual release process, meaning if I click here and say edit pipeline, I have done something called as a manual release, wherein I went ahead and created this release. What if I want the entire process to be automated right now? In here, there is a button called continuous deployment trigger. This is something that I'm talking about. So what I'll do is I'll click on this and I'll say enable continuous deployment trigger. Meaning now I am telling that whenever, coming back to our flow diagram, whenever you have someone committing the code to the develop branch, trigger a build pipeline. After you trigger a build pipeline, then trigger something called, or then give me something called artifact. As and when you have the artifact, please go ahead and do a release pipeline. And once you do a release pipeline, please go into the development stage, deploy the code onto web app running on Azure. This is what I'm now telling my pipeline to do. So if I come here and just click on this button called enable continuous deployment, and now I'll save this out and I'll say continuous deployment enabled. Now let's review a full cycle. I now have a build pipeline. I have branching policies in place. I have everything in place. So what I'll be doing right now is let's close all these things out and let me come down to my Azure DevOps. And this is where the entire life cycle begins. I am now a developer. I'm coming into the branch. I'm creating a branch for myself. Sorry, I'm creating a branch for myself. And I'll say this is feature. And I'll say this is DevOps test. And I'll just take a work item here and I'll say create. In the DevOps test branch, I will go ahead here into the demo application and into, let's say, the pages, into, let's say, the CS index.html, and I will say this is version 4. Commit my code, and I will now go ahead and create a pull request. And into the develop branch, this is where I want to create the pull request into. And I will just go ahead and say, okay, fine, great, create a pull request out here. Okay, what happened? Let's see. I'll say create a pull request. As in when I created a pull request, my branching policies came into picture. It started a validation build, meaning it now triggered a sonar that we integrated a couple of days ago, and it is waiting for someone called contributor to come and approve this out. Meaning all my branching policies are in place. So if I go here as a contributor, let me also sign into my account as a contributor. And parallelly, I have the validation running, meaning I have the sonar running here, which is analyzing the entire code. So it's the sonar is running here, it's analyzing the entire code. And if this passes, only then my TR will get merged. And I will have a contributor coming into place who needs to approve this build. So I as a contributor will just log into this. So I'm logging in now as a contributor, and once I log in, I'll go ahead and approve my pull request. And once all checks are done, my pull request will get merged. So this is where I am. My pull request will get merged into the branch. And once the pull request will get merged, the build pipeline will trigger because I have a continuous integration enabled. Once the build pipeline triggers, it will go ahead and produce something known as artifact. This should internally trigger something known as release pipeline, and this release pipeline should go ahead and deploy the artifact on to, let's say, something known as the Azure web app. this is what it has to do. This is the end-to-end procedure what it has to do. So I'll just go here as a contributor right now, and I'll say go into the pull requests. This is the pull request that I need to update. The build pipeline, the validation is still going on, so I'll just say approve. This is done. Now as a developer, I come here and I'll also say set to autocomplete and delete the branch after it gets completing. And once the autocomplete is set, it's now gone ahead and merged my code. It's now telling, okay, fine, the code is merged into the develop branch. I do not have the feature or the DevOps test branch right now. So if I go into my branches, I do not have the DevOps test branch, but I have a build pipeline that got triggered. Not this one, sorry. I got the build pipeline which got triggered, which is the .NET Core build, which just got triggered right now because I had a CI, meaning I have a continuous integration enabled on the build pipeline. And let's give it a second so that this pipeline can trigger and this pipeline can go ahead and this pipeline can give me an artifact. Since I'm using now a hosted agent, it's going to take some time in order to go ahead and trigger this out. So that's the reason to come over it. That's the reason to go over it. We use something known as a self-hosted agent out here. So let me give it a second. Let me refresh my screen. And let's see. Search thing, okay, find job parameters. And let's see. Is my job running? Do I have a job really running in the backend? Let's check this out. Okay, so there is no job that is running in the backend. Let's see. Agent pools and okay. Okay, so one thing out here, guys, is that if you look at this pipeline, right? I mean, if you look at this particular pipeline out here, what happened is that it's still waiting for an agent from the first pool. You see this, it's called first pool. But what happened is that after we had the demo yesterday, after the demo was done yesterday, I went ahead and deleted that pool here. So there is no agent inside that pool, but I forgot changing the pool on my build pipeline. So if you see here, my job is queued here. Like it's telling there is one queued and there are no agents out here at all. So this is offline. There's no agent at all. So this job will never be triggered. So I'll just have to go ahead and cancel this out. I'll say cancel it out. And I'll just do one small change in my pipeline. I will change my pipeline on to, let's say, the hosted agent of Azure so that our demo can move forward. So let me go here and let me change this to, let's say, Azure pipelines. And I'll take this agent as, let's say, Windows latest. And I'll save and queue this out. This will automatically get queued, but since I have disabled it out, I have disabled, let's say, or I have basically chosen a wrong pool that got cancelled. But this would have automatically been queued out here. So I'll just say save and run. So let's imagine that this was triggered by the pull request. Normally the pull request will trigger it out, and as and when it will get the agent, now it got the agent, as and when it will get the agent, it will go ahead and it will create, or it will basically trigger the entire build pipeline, and it will publish an artifact. And as and when it publishes the artifact, I need the release pipeline to get triggered. This is the end-to-end procedure what I need. So let's wait for about a minute here. This will go ahead and trigger my entire pipeline and produce the artifact out here. And once the artifact is published, so I have the published artifact is published, the pipeline is done. Now I didn't do anything, and if I go into the release pipeline and if I refresh this out a couple of times, I now have something known as release 2 that got created. Now I did not create it, I just refreshed my screen, I did not create it. It created automatically something known as a release process, and the release is also already started. So the release pipeline now is already started. It's going ahead, taking the artifact from my build pipeline, and it's releasing this artifact onto an Azure Web App. This is a new artifact right now. It's the version 4, it's not the version 3. My Azure or my application right now is running on version 3, but this one now has just initiated something called version 4. And if I now go ahead and browse this web application, I have a version 4 right now, which just got updated because of a PR. This PR just made this change. So from version 3, I just moved to something known as version 4. And as and when I did this, the developer is now able to see this particular code on the web application. Meaning this is now an end-to-end cycle that I'm now trying to achieve, wherein I'm just telling that, okay, fine, you know what? This is, let's say, the procedure that I want to establish, or this is, let's say, an automation that I want to achieve. So all the developer has to do is just go ahead and commit his changes to the develop branch, and the rest is taken care. Everything is now automated, and I was able to now create something known as a single stage release pipeline. This is a single stage. We'll talk about how do you create multiple stages and how do you handle that out and etc. But this is now called a single stage release pipeline, which is totally automated, which is fully automated right now. So any questions till here, guys? Anyone, anything till here? Anyone, any questions till here? Any questions, guys? I'm open to take questions now. Are you all able to follow, or did you all lose me somewhere? Anyone, any questions? Any questions,
Kiran,
guys?
that zip files you deployed, right? That usually
Mhm.
developers will provide, or how?
No, the zip file got produced as the result of my build pipeline. So the zip file that I deployed was what is the artifact that got produced by the end of the build pipeline out here. So if you look at this, the build pipeline produced the zip file. So the developer is just providing me the code, the raw code in the develop branch. I am producing a zip file, which is nothing but a compiled version of my entire code. And I'm now telling that, okay, fine, this zip file is the actual code, and I'm taking that zip file and I'm deploying it onto the Azure Web App. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, got it. So usually they will provide as a code, and we once compiled, it will become a zip file.
Correct. It will become a zip, and we'll take that zip and deploy it onto the web application.
Okay, and the path will be same for it will be common, right?
Yeah, the path is going to be common.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions here, guys? Okay, so now before coming to the Monday's class, now what I'll do is like I'll go ahead and send you all the link where you can see what are the interview questions that are asked very frequently. I will write it by the end of the day today and probably share it with you all. And before you come down to the Monday's class, please go ahead and revise what are ARM templates, because Monday's class you won't be able to understand if you don't understand what are ARM templates. So please go ahead and revise on ARM templates, and we'll meet on Monday and we'll discuss about infrastructure as a code, which is one of the most interview concept, most important concepts out there. So please make sure to do this revision, and till then have a great day ahead and have a great weekend, guys. Thank you.